On behalf of myself and the class marshals, we'd like to welcome you guys to our third in the series of four lectures. Today, we are honored to have Professor Michael Klarman. Please give a round of applause, please. Today, it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce a scholar whose contributions to the legal history have left an indelible mark on both academia and society. Since joining our faculty in 2008, Professor Klarman has been a guiding light for countless students. I would include myself in that, sharing not just his knowledge, but inspiring a deeper understanding of the complex tapestry that is American legal history. Holding the title of Charles Warren Professor of Legal History, his journey in academia began with an impressive array of educational achievements, from earning his BA and MA in political theory at the University of Pennsylvania to his JD from Stanford Law School, culminating in a B.Phil from Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. Professor Klarman's educational background is as rich as it is diverse. His career path has been marked by a commitment to excellence and an unwavering dedication to the exploration of constitutional law and history, as evidenced by his prolific writing and award-winning publications. His seminal work, From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, earned the prestigious Bancroft Prize for its insightful analysis of the Supreme Court's role in the struggle for racial equality, showcasing his ability to blend meticulous research with an engaging narrative. Beyond his scholarship, Professor Klarman's impact as an educator has been profound. His students at HLS have consistently praised his ability to challenge and inspire them to think critically and compassionately about the law's role in shaping society. Today, as we gather for the last lecture series, we are privileged to hear from a man whose career has been defined by a passion for justice, a commitment to truth, and a dedication to nurturing the next generation of legal minds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael J. Klarman.
That was very nice. It wasn't brief as we had agreed to. Ike is my occasional consultant. As some of you know, I'm writing a book on race and sports in American history, and Ike was a professional basketball player, as I think some of you may know. So I think I'm going to talk about 35 to 45 minutes. I haven't given this talk before. I don't know exactly how long it will last. I don't think I'm going to do questions afterwards. I encourage people, if you have questions, by all means, email them to me and I'll answer. Obviously, it's a great honor to be invited to give one of these lectures. Last lecture is a little bit foreboding, as in last lecture before Klarman dropped dead. So I'm not going to think of it as the last lecture. I'm going to think of it as a talk to celebrate your impending graduation, hopefully. I've wrestled with the topic. I've been asked to do this a few times in the past. I spent a lot of time in the past developing a talk that I thought was kind of fun and inspiring. It was a series of stories about Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and some of the disadvantages they had to overcome during their careers. And I am going to say something about that towards the end. But I think it would be lamentable and maybe even cowardly if I didn't talk about what I think is probably what is on everybody's mind today. Quoting two Harvard government professors, Enos and Levitsky, quote, "Democracy is in greater peril today than at any time in modern US history." I think that's true, but I would amend it just to be precise. That's true at the national level. It's not true at the state level. If you ask any African American who knows a lot about American history, I think they would tell you that most of the United States, certainly the southern states, were not a democracy until after the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Black people were universally disfranchised in most of the Deep South, 0% registration by 1910, despite a 15th Amendment that said no disfranchisement based on race is allowed by the Constitution. there were literally majority black counties in places like Mississippi and Alabama into the 1950s where not a single black person was registered to vote. Political violence was endemic for much of American history. And it's not as if white people in the South faced a perfectly free environment either. So a Mississippi history professor wrote a book in 1964. It's quite a good book called Mississippi, the Closed Society. If you were a white person and you ran a newspaper or you wrote letters to the editor and you criticized segregation, you criticized disfranchisement of blacks, you would pay a heavy penalty. It could be a visit from the Klan, it could be economic reprisals, loss of a job, loss of banking services. So what we are seeing today is unique at the national level, but we shouldn't pretend that it's never happened in American history. So there are three parts to the talk. I'm going to describe the longest part. I'm going to describe what I think is going on. Second, I'm going to suggest what people might do by way of resisting it. I wish that were a longer part of the talk. I don't have a tremendous amount to say. And then I'm going to try to say something hopeful at the end about why the story might have a happy ending. Now, I realize not everybody here is going to agree with the description. Some of you might strongly disagree. And I actually want to make it clear that if you want to leave right now, I think that's totally understandable. I'm going to say things about the current administration that if you think it's doing a good job, you might be offended by, you might think it's partisan, although everything I say today is a fact. I fact-checked everything I say. Obviously, interpretations are not facts, so people can disagree about interpretations. All I'm saying is I don't think it would be rude if you wanted to walk out right now. I don't think you should walk out in the middle. I think that's disruptive. And for anybody who does disagree, I've made this offer before. I'm totally happy to have lunch. I always respond to emails, but if you want to get together a group of people who disagree with what I'm going to say and want to have a productive conversation, I'm always happy to do that. All right, so I could easily go on for an hour or more just listing the autocratic maneuvers of the current administration. I think what I'm going to do in the first part of the talk will last about 25 minutes. So let's start with what hits close to home, which is the attack on the law firms and the attack on universities. I think you know that nobody has even tried to make a case that this is anything other than personal retribution by the president against what he sees as his political enemies. I'm not talking about the universities. I'll get to that in a minute. I'm talking about the law firms. He's gone after firms that have clients or lawyers who he doesn't think well of because of what they've done in the past. So he picks a law firm because Robert Mueller is there. He picks a law firm because some other lawyer who worked for Robert Mueller's investigation is there. This is as obvious a First Amendment violation as you could possibly imagine. There's no debate. The courts will rule this a First Amendment violation. It's probably also a Sixth Amendment violation. You don't get to punish lawyers, intimidate clients from using the lawyers that they want to have. But even if a court grants immediate relief, which they've done in 3 of these cases, doesn't do you any good if your clients are already out the door. My understanding is Perkins Coie is destroyed, even though they won in court, because if your clients are risk averse, they're not going to stick with you to find out what the administration has in mind. The largest law firms have been too intimidated to issue any general statement. Many of the biggest ones have capitulated. I'm not sure there are any on the top 20 income list who have signed the letter that was generated by other firms. They are now required to do $40 to $100 million in pro bono work that's approved of by the administration. Trump has suggested last week that that could include lawyering for coal mining companies. This is an open assault on the rule of law. If nothing like this has ever happened in American history, competing firms have swept in like vultures to pick up the clients who are leaving the targeted firms. It's obvious that collective action is necessary here. Authoritarians try to isolate and pick off victims one at a time. This is the easiest case for collective action. If every law firm in the country signed up to oppose this, then it couldn't happen because you can't punish all the law firms at the same time. Now, there's also the executive order. This is an independent point, though still about law firms. There's the executive order directing the Justice Department to seek sanctions against firms and lawyers who engage in vexatious or frivolous litigation against the government. That especially seems to be targeting people who do immigration law, who are some of the main barriers to the administration's immigration policy. Many of the policies seem obviously illegal and unconstitutional and are being challenged in court. So if you can pick off the lawyers who are bringing the challenges, you can insulate the policy from attack. Most recently, they've gone after the firm of Sussman Godfrey. They did that because the firm represented the Dominion voting machine company, which brought a huge defamation suit against Fox News, which won. They got a $750 million judgment for defamation, and now the executive order accuses them of weaponizing the legal system and degrading the quality of elections. They've attacked the leading Democratic voting rights lawyer in the country by name. That's Mark Elias. They're trying to intimidate him. I'm sure it'd be hard to count the number of death threats he receives now. The purpose, again, is to deter lawsuits against the administration. Lawyers and law firms are the ones who bring these suits. The court decisions have been the only meaningful check on the administration's actions in the first 3 months. This is actually a lot like what southern states did to the NAACP in the 1960s. The NAACP was the only organization that legitimately could bring lawsuits pursuing school desegregation. So the southern states came up with clever ways of trying to put the NAACP out of business, and I think that's quite analogous to what's happening now. Recently, there were the 2 executive orders naming former officials in the first Trump administration. One of these was the person who wrote, many of you won't remember this, you weren't following politics, but they wrote an anonymous editorial in the New York Times back around 2018, criticizing the administration. The other is this guy, Krebs, who ran the voter security, cybersecurity branch of the federal government. The executive order calls these people traitors. It attaints them, basically labeling them criminals, urging for prosecution. I don't think there's ever been anything like this in American history. Imagine the deterrent effect this has on critics of the administration. The President of the United States calls you a traitor and refers you to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The attacks on the universities, again, hitting close to home, you all know about this. The effort is to fundamentally impoverish them and chill their speech. They've cut off $400 million for Columbia, $1 billion for Cornell. This is based on a pretext. The pretext is anti-Semitism. I make no claim about whether there are legitimate claims of anti-Semitism against these universities. We could talk about that, but I will make a claim quite insistently and confidently that this administration does not care about anti-Semitism. There are leading officials in the administration who are more anti-Semitic in their statements than anything that has come out of these universities. Trump himself has a substantial record of anti-Semitic statements. Now, I was going to skip this, but I realize that some of you may think, well, I haven't heard that before, I don't believe that. So I'm just going to run through quickly some evidence from Trump's statements in the past that he's a larger anti-Semite than any president of Columbia, Harvard, or Penn. So in his autobiography, there's a famous story that Trump discovered that there was a black person working in the accounting office in the Trump business, and he said, and this was a quotation from his biographer, that he didn't want any black people counting money. The only people he wanted counting money in his business were little fat guys with yarmulkes. In 2016, he said Jews wouldn't vote for him because they didn't need his money. In 2017, after the neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," Trump said there were fine people on both sides. He said in 2024, if he lost the elections, Jews would bear a lot of the responsibility. To Jewish audiences, he frequently refers to Netanyahu as your prime minister, and he has told Jews who don't support his policies on Israel that they are bad Jews. Elon Musk, the second most powerful person in the Trump administration, regularly expresses enthusiasm for neo-Nazis, and he twice gave a Heil Hitler salute on Inauguration Day. On a 2023 Twitter post that invoked the Great Replacement Theory, which you probably know is a conspiracy that Jews are trying to, according to this quote, flood the country with hordes of minorities, Musk replied to a user, "You have said the actual truth." He supports the AFG in Germany. Indeed, he says the AFG is the only hope for Germany. The AFG is the party that was created by neo-Nazis decades ago. He tells Germans they focus too much on past guilt and we should get over the Holocaust. When he was criticized for Nazi salutes on Inauguration Day, he made a series of Nazi puns. I was going to quote them, but my spouse, who read this for me yesterday, said I shouldn't dignify them. Almost incomprehensible that no Republican official expressed any condemnation of these quotations of leading Nazi figures during World War II. I have a message for the GOP committee chairs. If you care about anti-Semitism, you should be investigating the two most prominent figures in your own political party. After that, you can look at Harvard and Columbia. Now, they don't care about anti-Semitism. What do they care about? They want control of universities. That's part of the autocratic playbook everywhere. Viktor Orban spent years trying to shut down Central European University in Hungary. Universities are rightly seen as centers of opposition to autocracy and fascism. The administration wants to control admissions. They want to put departments like the Middle Eastern Studies Department at Columbia under receivership. They want to end pro-Palestinian protests. They want to empower university police to make arrests. They want to ban mask wearing, but anyone who doesn't wear a mask and is identified, they want to punish them. If they're a foreign student, they're revoking their visas. Universities are largely capitulating. As I understand it, you're talking about essentially destroying science and medical schools, schools of public health. University presidents are put in impossible positions, but largely the choice they've made so far, with Princeton being a large exception, is to capitulate. We've never seen anything like this in American history. There was attacks on universities during the McCarthy era, but they weren't vulnerable in the same way that they are today because the federal government's funding for science has become such an indispensable part of what universities do. And for those who think everything the government does is a waste, it's actually a good idea because basic science is a public good, and if the government doesn't fund it, it's likely not to get done, at least not to the amount that we need. The effect at a minimum, and I'm talking about democracy and rule of law, but you shouldn't be unaware of some of the long-term effects that go well beyond democracy and the rule of law. They're going to kneecap US science. There are already hundreds of scientists in the process of leaving or leaving the country. China is recruiting among ethnic Chinese Americans. Go here, we'll leave you free to run your lab the way you want. We won't let you criticize the government, but we're not going to kneecap your science. Same thing in France and elsewhere in Europe. They're recruiting American science. America has the greatest science in the world. America discovered the vaccine for COVID. The long-term effect of this is unimaginable. Moving on to other rule of law and democracy topics, deportations without due process to a prison in El Salvador, which is known for being one of the most brutal in the Western Hemisphere. Make no mistake, the government's argument is you get no habeas. You're in El Salvador, you are beyond the jurisdiction of a US court. That means it makes no difference, none, whether you are a US citizen or whether you are not a US citizen. It doesn't matter if you can't get a writ of habeas corpus. The administration admits they made a mistake, but they're not acting to undo the mistake. 75% of these people who've been taken away to El Salvador have no criminal record. Many of them have tattoos. It turns out some of those tattoos were of their favorite soccer teams. One of them has an autism tattoo. If you wear a Michael Jordan jersey, that is taken as evidence that you are eligible for deportation as a gang member. Hundreds of student visas have been revoked in the last weeks. Essentially, foreign students have no free speech rights in the United States. You would have to be crazy as a foreign student now to speak up in protest of anything the administration does. The lawyer who acknowledged that the government had mistakenly sent someone to El Salvador was put on administrative leave because he was not zealously pursuing the interests of the administration. Just think about that. Lawyers who take an oath to represent the interests of the United States, the Constitution, to be faithful agents of the court, was put on administrative leave for saying, we made a mistake, and I'm trying to find out from my clients why we're not undoing that mistake. President has incentivized political violence by pardoning violent insurrectionists. The threat to federal judges is now pervasive. You saw what happened at the governor's mansion yesterday in Pennsylvania. The Attorney General and the President of the United States now regularly attack federal judges by name, most notably James Boasberg, one of the finest judges on the federal bench. They send pizzas to the judges and their family members to make it clear they know where they live. Their children are being attacked online. They have heightened security. The Trump administration has removed security from other prominent critics, people like Liz Cheney and Anthony Fauci, people who constantly receive death threats. The administration has taken away their security. Numerous Republican congressmen say privately they are scared to vote against MAGA for personal safety reasons. I'm now quoting those Harvard government professors again, quote, there is mounting evidence that physical threats and fear of violence are intimidating Republican politicians into doing Trump's bidding. I think what Trump is doing is consistent with paving the way for a military coup. That's why you fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's why you fire the leading JAG officers and replace them with loyalists. I'm not saying he is paving the way for a military coup. I'm simply saying his actions are consistent with what you would do if you were. You know about Mahmoud Khalil, several others on student visas or even green card holders, kidnapped by ICE, taken to Louisiana, put into a prison that is known for torture and violence, no crime alleged, no due process provided. No foreign student, as I said, in the United States can risk criticizing the administration. For the most part, their universities are not doing a very good job of defending them because they've been intimidated. You probably heard about the French scientist who came to a conference in the United States. Customs took away his phone. They found criticism of Trump and they wouldn't let him in the country. Intimidation of the media. ABC and CBS have settled defamation suits against them by Trump that they almost surely would have won in court. They are channeling literally tens of millions of dollars to Trump and his family because they have larger business stakes at interest. Their news programs are trivial compared to their billion-dollar enterprises. Trump has called for the investigation of CNN and MSNBC. As you know, the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times were both intimidated out of making presidential endorsements in the 2024 campaign. The Washington Post has suppressed an editorial that was critical of Trump and the billionaires who fawn over them. The Associated Press has been kicked out of the press pool for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. They admit a right-wing podcaster in his place who receives hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Russian government. Peter Baker of the New York Times, who used to serve as the Moscow bureau chief, writes, quote, having served as a Moscow correspondent in the early days of Putin's reign, this reminds me of how the Kremlin took over its own press pool and made sure that only compliant journalists were given access. Intimidation of speech goes well beyond the media. Corporations and bankers now largely refuse to criticize even the tariff idiocy of last week because they are too afraid of alienating the administration. So even policies that it would be hard to find anybody defending as sensible policies, you're not going to find criticized in the way they ought to be because people are too afraid of putting their heads up. All right, quick word about racism. Not sure exactly how that fits with democracy and the rule of law, but I think probably you can make a pretty good case that you don't have a democracy if you have a system of white supremacy. So let me give a few quick illustrations of the racism of the administration. First is the effort to blame everything bad that happens in the world on DEI. There's a plane crash in the Potomac River. It must be DEI. That was Trump's initial reaction. I don't know if any other president in American history could have survived something like saying that. Same thing with Los Angeles fire damage. That must be DEI. It must be because there's a lesbian in charge of the fire department in Los Angeles. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, denounces General C.Q. Brown as a DEI hire, i.e. he's black. You note the irony of that. Pete Hegseth is the least qualified defense secretary and probably the least qualified cabinet official in American history. He is anti-qualified. Not only does he not have qualifications, but he has enough strikes against him that he couldn't possibly have been confirmed by anybody except this Republican Senate. Our military bases are being renamed after Confederate generals who owned slaves. They've taken down references, for example, to Jackie Robinson on a DOD website. Jackie Robinson famously served in the military. He was court-martialed but acquitted for protesting segregation on military buses during World War II. This is several years before he desegregated baseball. Law firms are now being threatened over their minority scholarships. The administration attacks college affinity groups. The administration makes a big deal of rehiring a Doge member who resigned after he was quoted as saying he wanted to, all of these are quotes, universalize Indian hate, that he favored a eugenic immigration policy, and he said he had bragged that he was a racist before it was cool to be racist. He had the decency to resign, but then they very ostentatiously hired him back because they wanted to make it clear we don't fire our friends regardless of what they say. A State Department appointee said that, quote, competent white men, close quote, must be in charge for things to work. Musk has liked the claim that graduates of historically black colleges and universities have lower IQs. He has liked the claim that no black airline pilot would exist without a DEI program. His company has been sued multiple times for race discrimination. The administration, as you know, has shut down every refugee program in the country, including thousands of people who've already been approved to come from Afghanistan. There's only one exception. They still are in favor of refugees who are white Afrikaners, who they say are victims of race discrimination in South Africa. They are rewriting American history to eliminate discussion of slavery and Jim Crow at many public high schools and universities. I certainly could not teach my constitutional history classes, which talk a lot about slavery and Jim Crow. Authoritarians always try to rewrite history to suit their purposes. One way of controlling the present is by distorting the past. The sorts of statements I quoted to you would have been disqualifying for any political appointee in the last 50 years. It is astonishing to me, and I'm not that easily astonished. I've been giving talks suggesting that Trump played the authoritarian playbook since before he was elected, just based on the things he said in the 2016 campaign. I'm not easily astonished, but I would not have believed this sort of open racism would be tolerated in the United States in the year 2025. This is not only an authoritarian regime, it is also a neo-white supremacist regime. All right, part two, what do you do about it? Unfortunately, I don't have a lot to say here. I have a few things to say, and then I have a few more things to say about why you hopefully will remain optimistic and hopeful. The best advice I had was for talks I gave before the election, was don't elect an authoritarian who tells you he's an authoritarian, but we've done that, and he's legitimate president of the United States. So 4 points. Everybody needs to do something, point one. Point two, the importance of collective action. Point three, the importance of unity in the opposition or resistance. You need to be fighting the bad guys, not fighting yourself. And fourth, there may be some creative ways in which it's possible to build larger alliances, ways in which politics, it's possible to build some bridges to overcome sort of the structural political problems we have, which incentivize extremism. So I'll say a few words about each of those. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I think most of us assumed for way too long that it was an engine that would run on its own. It didn't need any tending. It didn't need any monitoring, that you could just sit back and watch. I understand the temptation to tune things out and just live your life. It is bad for your mental health to fixate on this stuff, and I can attest to that because I fixate on this stuff. It is not good for your mental health. If you tune out entirely, the autocrats win. That's part of the strategy. Everybody else is afraid. Everybody else doesn't want to listen to this. They want to get on with their lives. The autocrats win if you tune it out. You need to do something. You don't need to do everything. The most obvious thing to do is to vote. Make sure your friends vote. Participate in elections, postcards, knock on doors, make phone calls. Kamala Harris would be president if a few million of the 15 to 20 million people who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote in 2024 had participated. Don't over-catastrophize. Of course, there will be elections in 2026 and 2028. It is no longer the authoritarian playbook that you cancel elections. You can't get away with that, certainly not in the United States, where we have 250 years of democracy. You try to tilt the landscape in your favor, but you're not able to prevent elections. The autocrats in Poland lost an election in 2023, and now the Democrats are back in power. The United States could certainly repeat that. I would bet money that Democrats will take the House in 2026. It's not clear how much that matters. Everything I've recited that Trump has done, he's done without the acquiescence of Congress. It's very hard to take the Senate. It's possible, it's not easy. I assume Democrats will likely win the House. Trump is also likely to tank the economy, and voters will not like that. The tariff idiocy already took a couple $1 trillion off the wealth of the stock market. I assume there are going to be high prices because of the tariff plans. I think Trump won, and I may be deluding myself, but I think a perfectly sufficient explanation is he won because of high prices. The voters who pay the least attention, the ones who are least likely to vote, they're the ones who were rebelling against high prices. They'll rebel against high prices even if Trump is the president. I would focus a lot on corruption, and there's a lot of that going around. Voters don't like corruption, and one reason they elect populists is they buy the argument that everybody in politics is corrupt. Well, as you know, there are a lot of allegations of insider trading in the administration over the radical tariff shifts last week. Trump has made billions of dollars on the meme coin that was issued in his likeness. I would be talking a lot about corruption and getting voters energized about that. You need to inform yourself. This is the other side of you can't tune out. You need to inform yourself about what's going on politically. The information media ecosystem is as bad as it's ever been. It's filled with misinformation and downright lies. The traditional mainstream media is doing a terrible time of covering the Trump administration. I include the New York Times in that. The Washington Post is completely lost. You need to figure out what reliable news sources are, and you need to know what to believe. You need to figure out which Substacks to read, which podcasts to listen to. There are some newspapers, many of them are outside the United States, like The Guardian and Independent. There are ways to get news that actually talks about the truth, but it's not that easy to do. Demonstrate. I think this is actually the most important thing you can do. I am not by nature a big demonstrator. My spouse is. She's been to at least 8 or 10 of these. She goes to a couple a week now. I went to the Tesla takedown rally a couple weeks ago and the hands-off demonstration. These are empowering, they're joyful, they inspire opposition politicians to take a stand. I'm pretty sure one reason why Democrats in Congress have started speaking up more is because they see their constituents demanding that there be some leadership. Act locally. This is another very good suggestion Lisa had when I showed her this yesterday. Democracy and the rule of law are procedural. Obviously, we have substantive commitments we care a lot about. Trump doesn't believe that climate change is real. He still says it's a hoax. Trump wants to deport 10 million people from the United States. Do you think that's a good idea? The administration is declaring war on transgender people. whatever your substantive issue is, you could spend your time doing that if that seems more imperative to you than democracy and the rule of law. There are a million different things that one can be doing. You need to assess your risk tolerance. That seems really important. What are you willing to do for your values? Are you willing to risk your job? Are you willing to get posted on social media and have people harass you? Are you willing to tell a law firm you won't interview with them until they grow a spine? Are you willing not to buy a Tesla? Are you willing not to shop at Whole Foods or on Amazon because Jeff Bezos capitulated and because Elon Musk is a dangerous, dangerous person? How much are you willing to inconvenience yourself on account of principle? I'm pretty sure that the administration backed down on Social Security because of demonstrations, because of phone calls. So you may have seen the policy is they're not brave enough to say they're going to cut Social Security. So they say instead, if you're a first-time registrant or you're trying to increase your benefits, you need to show up in person or you need to do it over the computer. And we're talking about elderly people who may not know how to use the internet and may not have transportation. They're not going to take your phone calls anymore. Right? That's a way of trying to save money by not giving people who are entitled to their benefits. Well, they backtracked on that because that's a powerful constituency that manifested their opposition. It is possible to get them to change their mind on stuff. Second, I've already said, autocrats intimidate and isolate. Collective action is the solution. I think, again, it's somewhere between lamentable and reprehensible the way the law firms have behaved. It would be the easiest thing in the world to mobilize every law firm in the country to stand up what is the most basic principle of the rule of law. You don't get to attack lawyers because of who their clients are. You don't get to attack lawyers because you don't like their opinions, their political opinions. I think a statement by a large number of law students that you will refuse to work for cowardly law firms would have an effect. It would simultaneously protect those who are signing. You can't retaliate against everybody all at once. Third, and this is all easy for me to say. I have the most secure job in the world. I could retire tomorrow. I'm not afraid of losing my job. It's easy for me to say these things. I'm not worried about retaliation. You all are starting your careers. You need to figure out what risks you are prepared to take. This is not the time for internal division. A lot of people disagreed with what Chuck Schumer did with the continuing budget resolution. I'm actually of the view that it was a very hard choice. There were consequences in either direction. But the one thing I'm really sure about, it is not good for Democrats now to be attacking Democratic leaders. You want to elect a different leader, that's fine, but Democrats need to be not feuding with each other because that is not going to help keep your eye on the ball. The last point is a point about creating political opportunities. I got this from a Larry Diamond podcast. He's an important political scientist who studies democracy out at Stanford. This is the flip side of the previous point. So the previous point is don't create divisions within your own community. And the opposite point, the mirror image, is look for ways to build broader alliances, ways to create allies. There are a lot of those people around. Michael Luttig, who many of you will recognize as a fierce critic of the Trump administration, he was the most conservative appellate judge in the country in the 1990s. My friend John Woodward's nodding his head. He went to law school in the 1990s. We were friends and we lived in the same dorm at Penn in the late 1970s. Michael Luttig is one of the most fierce critics of the administration because it turns out he actually believes in the rule of law and he believes in democracy. Liz Cheney, Bill Kristol, Charlie Sykes, those are all deeply conservative people who in the last 20 years have turned out to be, or in the last 5 years have turned out to be the biggest Trump critics. They really believe in the rule of law and democracy in addition to being very conservative in their other political views. So here's the example Larry Diamond gave. Some of you who are very politically inclined know about the Nebraska Senate race in 2024. This guy Osborne, Dan Osborne, ran for the Senate as an independent. A Democrat would have a very difficult time winning in Nebraska, so the Democrats didn't field a candidate. The Democrats supported the independent. Osborne didn't win. He lost by 7 points, but Trump won the state by 21 points. So Osborne ran 14 points better than the Republican opponent, Deb Fischer. In a lot of states, that would make the difference. That's a kind of creative way in which you might be able to elect people who are anti-MAGA, even if they don't share your entire agenda. Same thing's true about Alaska. Those of you who are curious why Lisa Murkowski is the most anti-MAGA of the Republicans, it might be partly because of her personal courage and personal values, but it's largely because of the structure of Alaska elections. Alaska has nonpartisan primaries, and Alaska has ranked choice voting. Those exclude the most extreme candidates. She doesn't need the Republican Party nomination. She doesn't have to worry about gerrymandering because it's a Senate race, and ranked choice voting will enable her to win over more extreme candidates who are ranked lower by other voters. All right, that's all I had to say about what to do. I have a little more to say about something to be hopeful for. So it helps me a lot to be an historian. And I should point out as well, those of you who don't follow the Substack or listen to the podcasts of Sherilyn Ifill, I think she's one of the most incisive observers. She's the former head of the NAACP. She's now at Howard University Law School setting up a Center for Democracy. And she also, because she's an expert on the history of race in the NAACP, I think she also shares the same sort of optimism from looking backwards. And indeed, some of my points come directly from her. All right, so think about all the change, incredible change, unimaginable change produced by people in the past who were affiliated with certain movements. Abolitionism started in Boston. William Lloyd Garrison was vilified. He was dragged around Boston with a rope around his neck, a mock lynching to show what people in Boston thought of the abolitionists. They hated the abolitionists because the abolitionists were too supportive of racial equality and they were a threat to the Union. 35 years later, the 13th Amendment barred slavery forever in the United States. Suffragists. There was a serious effort by women suffragists to get the 14th or 15th Amendment to protect women's suffrage. There wasn't enough support. For 50 years, they fought a battle at state levels across the country. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton never lived to see women's suffrage at the national level, but in 50 years, they accomplished women's suffrage. Gay rights. In 1960, it was a crime in every state in the country to have sex with somebody of the same sex. You were barred from the military, you were barred from the federal civil service, they conducted witch hunts against you. Gays were treated as criminals, as sinners, as moral deviants. And in 2015, the Supreme Court said there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. It's possible to make enormous social change. It sometimes takes decades. I think restoring democracy is actually going to have to be seen as a similar enterprise. There is tremendous damage being done, and it's not like you can undo it all by snapping your fingers and winning one election. Second point, it's inspiring, I think, to think of the heroes that come to us from history. What was Thurgood Marshall up against? Here I'm going to invoke a couple of the points from the standard last lecture of Klarman. Thurgood Marshall, what was he up against? How unlikely it was that he would succeed. It was hard for a black person in the South to get a legal education. There were not black law schools in the South, right? He went to Howard in Washington, D.C. There was no black law school in Mississippi or Alabama during this time period. You were insulted by judges when they're arguing cases in the Fifth Circuit in the 1930s, challenging the exclusion of blacks from primary elections. The judges literally turn their backs on them. They swivel around to indicate their profound disrespect for black lawyers. That's how the judges treat them. Thurgood Marshall risked physical violence nearly every time he went into a Southern community to organize blacks around litigation. He was nearly lynched in Columbia, Tennessee in 1946 when he was representing some black defendants. Other NAACP lawyers, a man named Alexander Luby, another named Arthur Shores, had their homes blown up while they were leading school desegregation litigation. We're now talking about the late 50s, early 60s in Nashville and Birmingham, respectively. In the late 1930s, I think Thurgood Marshall did not dream that during his lifetime you would see an end to formal segregation, and Brown was decided 15 years later. Now, that's not to say anything about how much additional racial progress was or was not made. Thurgood Marshall was deeply depressed when he died in the early 1990s by the state of race relations. But the idea that school segregation would be abolished as unconstitutional, I think, did not occur to him as something that would happen within decades, and it happened in 15 years. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as you know, was one of 9 women to attend Harvard Law School in the fall of 1956. Harvard had about the same size class, so 9 women out of about 550. They were insulted by the dean, who invited them to dinner, all 9 women, early in the semester, and asked them why they were there taking up a spot that could have presumably been put to better use by a man. Women at the time were not permitted into the law school dorms. Maybe that was doing them a favor. They were not allowed tables at the faculty dining room. The law review banquet invited members to bring their fathers, but not their mothers. There were no female teachers. RBG had 2 years at Harvard, 1 year at Columbia, and no female teachers during those 3 years. She graduated first in her class, tied for first at Columbia. She barely got a clerkship. One of her professors had to go to great lengths to get it for her. She was Jewish, she was female, she had a young child. 3 strikes and you're out. There were no women's rights courses taught anywhere in the country till RBG began teaching one at Rutgers in the late 1960s. There were no role models. There was 1 federal judge in the country who was female in 1960. Judges made fun of her arguments. She argued a case in the Supreme Court about 1975-76, and after the argument, one of the judges leaned over the bench and said something like, "So you won't take Susan B. Anthony on the dollar? That's not enough for you." By the time of her death, there were 3 women on the court. Now there are 4 women on the court. Women were 2% of the nation's law professors in the mid-1960s. They're 44% today. Women were 1 to 2% of the nation's law school students in the 1950s. Today, it's 56% of AALS accredited schools. Half of Harvard Law School students are female. Before the late 1960s, there had been 1 woman in the history of the United States to clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, about 1/3 of the current clerks are female. These are extraordinary changes. RBG proves they are possible. They didn't happen overnight. Heroic figures led the way, and nobody's asking anyone to be a hero. All we're asking is that everybody do their part. Third point, so much less is expected of us than them. I've already said Marshall assumed he might be shot anytime he went south to argue a case in a southern courtroom. Harry Moore, who was the lead organizer for the NAACP in Florida, was blown up in his house along with his wife on Christmas Eve in 1951 because of his civil rights activity. Medgar Evers, as many of you know, was assassinated in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963, 6 months after he had put his name on a school desegregation suit. Nobody's asking anybody to sacrifice their lives. There aren't that many Alexei Navalny's in the world. All right, we're not lacking for current heroes. I think one can see them demonstrating their courage. Stephen Banks, who's the head of the pro bono practice at Paul Weiss, has resigned after the law firm capitulated to Trump. He decided to devote himself to legal services for the homeless. Chris Eisgruber, the president of Princeton, has made himself a target by going on podcasts and writing op-eds, identifying the current threat to universities from this administration as the greatest in the history of higher education. He's trying to rally other presidents of universities to join him. You all know about Rachel Cohen, who resigned from Skadden to protest its capitulation. Immigration lawyers, I think especially, who are going without sleep, who I think are risking death threats and probably physical violence, trying to prevent the fascistic policies that are going on today. They are all heroes, in my opinion. Hopefully that will encourage others. You need to understand this is now a long-term battle. Might not have been if you'd kept them out of office in the first place, but it certainly is now. The next 4 years are going to be like hell. There's a vast amount of rebuilding that will need to be done. Everybody needs to do their part. You have special skills to resist. you have relatively privileged positions, and you have knowledge and insight into what is going on in the world. With special skills and special insight comes special responsibilities, to quote Spider-Man. Nobody is asking you to devote your life to lawyering for democracy. Some of you are doing that. I can't tell you how much I admire that choice. For the rest of you, I would think of it as a hobby. You spend a certain amount of time each week exercising. You spend a certain amount of time cooking. You spend a certain amount of time reading for fun. I think you need to spend a certain amount of time working to defend democracy. As much as I admire Martin Luther King Jr., I do not agree with him that the arc of the universe, while long, bends toward justice. I'm pretty sure you have to push it in that direction. The time that we took American democracy for granted, I think, is over. We need to get to work. I hope you will enlist in that enterprise. The cause needs you. I think you will find great personal gratification in doing it. It is partially a curse to live in these terrifying times. We all want to just live our lives, enjoy ourselves, and trust the system to operate independently, but it turns out it doesn't work that way. It's a curse, but also a blessing to live in these times. Serving a cause larger than yourself is ennobling, and it's invigorating, and I think it's ultimately supremely satisfying. That's a point that seems more obvious and potent to me as I get older. I know for a fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall would have told you that. So I'm going to end now with two quotes that I think capture the current moment. The first is from Frances Perkins. She was the first ever to serve in a president's cabinet. She was FDR's Secretary of Labor, so this is the 1930s. She was also one of the most important social reformers in the first half of the 20th century. That's how she got into FDR's cabinet. Perkins said, "There's always a large horizon. There's much to be done. It is up to you to contribute some small part to a program of human betterment for all time." Some small part. You have to do something. You don't have to do everything. She was talking about industrial reform. She was talking about fair labor standards. She was talking about minimum wages and maximum hours. Today, I'm talking about democracy. I think everybody has a social obligation and a moral obligation to do something if you want to live in a democracy. Second quotation is from the great author James Baldwin. Quote, "There's never time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now." Right? The time is now. I leave you with that thought. Thank you for giving me so much time to share my thoughts with you. I've taught many of you. Thank you for giving me the privilege to play a role in your legal education. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Myself and my colleagues at the law school are very proud of you, and we expect we'll be even prouder with what you do with your legal educations. Congratulations, good luck, and thank you for your time.